Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another connected webinar. Topic, of course, is a very timely one. We have coronavirus and the supply chain implication in construction. Uh, the news is very much still out there on the coronavirus, of course, and of course the supply chain. And lately, we have seen supply chain implications that's happening throughout in other industries. So we thought this would be timely for us to host one in construction. We have an expert panel today. Our presenters for this webinar today. We have Peter Kapler, who's the Senior Vice President, National Director of Performance Security at Aon. We also have Cherry Haynes, Construction Risk Engineer, Subcontractor Default Insurance at AXA XL. And we also have Andrea Lee, partner of Clayhot Bowles, actually, as well. Just for housekeeping, we would ask you to save the questions till the end, where we will open up for the Q&A session for you to ask the questions directly. Or if you have the question in advance, you can actually use your chat on the GoToMeeting itself and actually ask in terms to kind of actually type in the question as well. So over to Peter. Peter, all yours.
Thanks very much, Kenny. And a huge thanks to the Canadian Construction Association for accommodating us on very, very short notice to discuss this very important topic. And also a huge thanks to my expert co-panelists here for volunteering their time for this webinar and also preparing the material. So thank you very much for this. We've got quite a bit of presentation material to cover in an hour, so I'm going to jump straight into it. What I thought I would highlight, first of all, is from a timeline perspective. I think it's important for us to consider that so far this has been an 8-week phenomenon. So if we go back to, just go over the timeline, December 21st, 2019 is when the Chinese Center of Disease Control first identified dozens of cases of, at the time it was a pneumonia of an unknown cause. Fast forward a couple of weeks, the scientists isolate and determine the genetic sequence of this unique novel coronavirus. And then another week and a half at this point, the Chinese state media already reporting the first known death. Couple of weeks into that, things escalating very rapidly. The entire city of Wuhan, 11 million people cut off and quarantined by the Chinese authorities. So Wuhan, as we probably know at this point, a huge city, 11 million people, a massive population. And unfortunately, the quarantine, a little bit too late by that point because of the Chinese Lunar New Year holiday. There were already about 5 million people who had left Wuhan to effectively go home for the holidays. But a week later, the WHO had declared a global health emergency on account of the coronavirus, with 10,000 cases officially recognized. February 11th, another week and a half later, the official fatality toll in China surpassed 8,000. And with this being a very rapidly evolving situation, we've got up to 73,000 cases as of yesterday. So what I thought I would do is just go over the numbers a little bit. This is a logarithmic scale of the confirmed cases, the fatalities, as well as the number of patients recovered since late December 2019. Very optimistic to see the number of recovered cases now in surpassing the number of fatalities. What I thought I would do is juxtapose this upon some other epidemics that we've seen in the last couple of years. So, for example, the swine flu in 2009, we've got that in orange. In purple, we've got the most commonly related coronavirus being the SARS epidemic back in 2003. And then the Ebola case epidemic in 2014. This is a number of cases. And the coronavirus being in dark blue, so really starkly stands out. I mean, it's just a huge J curve there relative to some of these other pandemics that we've seen. And why is that? Why is this thing so contagious? Let's talk about the nature of the infection a little bit. So probably the most remarkable thing about this virus is that it's communicable during the asymptomatic period, meaning that you can carry this disease, you can spread it to other people without knowing that you have it. The research done to date confirms or suggests that the median period for without showing symptoms is about 3 days. Having said that, there's been cases that have shown up to 28 days without showing symptoms while being infectious. So that's an entire month without showing symptoms. And as such, we've seen the response to this being, 14 days mandatory quarantines, whether they be for workers coming back to urban centers or for anyone that is, flying out, back home who had been in Wuhan or an affected region. From a communicability standpoint, how does this get around? So obviously direct contact with the virus or any airborne droplets. So this would be, just like a common cold or a cold and flu. Someone sneezes, someone coughs, getting in contact with that. Also the direct contact transmission. So if you touch something where recently someone, touched their nose or touched their mouth, you get in contact with the virus. However, there have been reports and studies done in China that, in fact, on surfaces, this virus can stay alive for up to 5 days, which is quite remarkable. And probably most concerning and responsible for how easily this has been transmitted is the fact that there are now confirmations that this is now aerosol transmissible. That means that without necessarily droplets, but just by way of the air in micro droplets, this thing can get around, and we've seen examples such as the unfortunate cases of the cruise ships where, despite the fact people are being quarantined, despite very good care being taken to ensure that, the transmission is not being shared, people are getting sick from the recycled air. And, you just think about the cases of some of these quarantine buildings where the air is probably recycled, and the fact that this virus can, in fact, get around. So it is very, very contagious. And we get into a discussion about the R0 estimate. So the R0 is effectively a measure of how communicable a disease is. So if an R0 is 1-to-1, it basically means that on average, and of course these are all averages, on average one person will infect one other person. So the common flu, the influenza, has an R0 factor of about 1.2. SARS had an average factor of about 2.4, meaning that every person would infect on average 2.4. However, the big difference with SARS was the fact that SARS was only communicable when somebody was showing symptoms. So with the COVID-19, you being able to communicate that without showing symptoms, and the fact that it's transmissible by way of aerosol, and this is speculative at this point, but the R0 is estimated anywhere between 1.4 to 5.5, which is very, very high. So if we look at these numbers and the fact that we've racked up about 73,000 cases over an 8-week period, what is probably most concerning about this is the fact that of those 73,000 cases, 16% have been reported as being in serious condition. So serious conditions means it's ICU care, it's, you need oxygen to breathe, you basically need a hospital bed. So if we exponentially take that 73,000 case and apply that, even in countries with modern, good medical systems, that very quickly starts to overwhelm a medical system, which unfortunately lifts that fatality rate significantly. So we're dealing with obviously a serious issue here. The other case is just, I wanted to make a point about the reporting accuracy. So the information that we're getting around the cases, the majority of it is being reported by the Chinese Communist Party. So we can take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. There is some opaqueness there with respect to what they're willing to share. We've also seen that the testing methodology has been changing. Initially it was just test kits. Now we've been hearing that it's CT scans. The test kits have been reported to be in shortage. Also, there is a lab time delay for the test kits to come back and for those to be reported of at least 8 days. So there's been some inconsistencies there. And also, foreign experts have not been allowed into Wuhan, the epicenter of the outbreak, until February 17th. So that was just yesterday. So we may see that there's been some additional updates there to those numbers because, there's a lot of speculation out there that really that 73,000 is grossly underreported. So if we look at that, if we look at the numbers that are reported versus, what the actual response has been from the CCP, from the Chinese Communist Party, the response has been overwhelming. So we've seen Lunar New Year celebrations canceled. We've seen a massive quarantine of 60 million people in strict quarantine, 700 million people in some degree of quarantine. These are absolutely staggering numbers of effectively martial law equivalency being implemented in affected areas of China. There are restrictions on private vehicle use that have been reported. strict quarantine isolation of any citizens in suspected cases being taken away, placed in these quarantine centers. We've seen, the construction of massive emergency hospitals in a 10-day period. Just a overwhelming response from the Chinese Communist Party for what up to date has been in and around 2,000 fatalities. So, if we want to sort of get at the truth of something, we look at what people do versus what they say. Okay, let's talk about the economic implications. So one of the biggest issues after the Lunar New Year, which was extended through February 10th by an additional week, has been the fact that 80% of companies in the Shanghai region so far have not had the workers to restart full-time production. So we talked about the 14-day quarantine. That's an issue. So we're seeing that in the Yangtze River Delta as well, which is where a lot of the manufacturing is coming from. But also a huge issue to date has been the lack and shortages of mandated PPE available to workers. So for workers to get back on the line who've traveled in from central China, not only do they need to sit through a 14-day quarantine before they can get back into production, but also they need to wear a brand new mask and new gloves every time they show up to work. And guess what? There's a huge surgical mask shortage in China, who also happens to be the largest producer, and they're on lockdown from production. So it's a real catch-22. It's a real tough situation from a PPE standpoint. And what I've included there is just a couple of graphs that talk about and demonstrate the amount of air pollution that's been happening. So it's a good indication of overall production. So in the blue there, we've got a 6-year average for pollution, and in yellow is the equivalent for 2020. So obviously we see no activity, massive production fallout in the main industrial production regions. Economic implications, transit and shipping. We've seen a report recently from DHL where effectively, again, drivers have to be quarantined. Things are not moving around. Drivers are refusing inland trips from Wuhan. Trucks from Hubei, which is the epicenter province, with plates from Hubei, they're being prevented from moving around. They're getting stopped. Warehouses, depots, and ports are operating with about less than 50% staff right now. So companies are struggling to move goods around in China, and they're also struggling to move goods out of the country. And I've got a graph here that effectively looks at congestion as a defined ratio of peak to non-peak travel times using AMAP data. And we see here after the Lunar New Year, so the bottom line there in dark blue is 2020 relative to all the other ones. So no one is moving around in all of China. It's very stark. From a commodity standpoint, we see economic implications there as well. Oil and base metals are currently down from mid-January peaks, 10% down. And then the demand for products in China, such as steel, construction steel, the third point there for construction steel demand, that should actually say 80%. So that's an error. That's 80% down year over year. So we're seeing massive, shortages in demand. Nothing is happening from a production standpoint. And this is coal consumption at power plants. A lot of power in China is still generated by way of coal-fired plants. So we see here, similar to the traffic graph, this is the last 4 years compared to each other. In 2020, we're basically seeing zero coal consumption because there's very little production. No one's at their factories, very little electricity generated. So things are happening very quickly. We're starting to see quite a few headlines right now in terms of the impact of Western companies or other companies that rely on the Chinese supply chain. There was a Dun & Bradstreet report just published this weekend that talked about the most impacted provinces and how much business they actually represent in China, and also how many businesses from abroad are reliant on them. So they account for 90% of active businesses in China and 50% of total employment in the country. So in terms of how that impacts the global supply chain, 163 of 1,000 of Fortune 1,000 companies have tier 1 suppliers in the region. Tier 1 being defined as sole supplier or number 1 supplier. And then we've got 5 million global companies overall, and basically the vast majority of Fortune 1000 companies have tier 2 plus suppliers in the region, meaning they're your number 2 supplier or number 1 supplier. So it's massive, massive supply chain impact. And then we've already seen a number of companies reporting that they're having supply chain and production issues. So we've seen Hyundai shutting down South Korean production lines due to a lack of Chinese-made parts. That was February 6th already. We've seen a Serbian Fiat plant shut down for about a week due to a shortage of Chinese parts. We've seen Nissan close a factory in Japan due to supply parts and other shortages. And actually, just before hopping on the webinar, I saw a report from Land Rover. They talked about the fact that they've got maybe parts for another 2 weeks, and then heading into March, they're out of parts. They're going to have to shut down production. And of course, we saw the big news coming out of Apple just overnight. So 10% of Foxconn's workforce has reported to work full-time. This is as of yesterday. That's only 10% of the manufacturer of your AirPods, your Apple product. And Apple has now cut quarterly revenue and profitability guidance on Chinese demand, but also Chinese production challenges. So no one's buying anything, no one's producing anything in China right now. So running a little bit over time, but all that to say, the impact to the construction supply chain, it's not a matter of if at this point, it's a matter of when. We're already seeing impact. It's just a question of how long this takes before we see an impact of this in construction in North America and specifically Canada. So I will turn over now to Cherie Haynes, who's going to dig deeper into construction supply chain.
Hi, all. Let's go to the first slide, Peter. We've got a lot of companies, bracing for the loss from this viral outbreak, and the damage so far has been kind of muted, frankly, and that's thanks to that stroke of timing of it happening over the Lunar New Year. The outbreak happened to hit just when the Chinese factories were going to be closed anyway. That's a yearly phenomenon. So some of the lack of productivity there was baked in, but that respite absolutely will not last. As Peter just said, it's not an if, it's a when. Much of industrial China still remains on lockdown for the next few weeks, which is a very real possibility. Western businesses that depend on those imports will start to be affected. Will this affect you before the disease plateaus and starts to slope off? It's really hard to know. And everyone's trying to get some perspective on that. Many of us looking back at the SARS outbreak to try to get hands around how this may play out. But by comparison, the SARS outbreak faded pretty quickly, and China was booming again by the end of the year, and the world economy was largely unscathed by it overall. But the world has changed so much in the intervening years in ways that are not favorable to containing that type of economic damage. Now, China accounts for 16% of global economic output, which is a huge jump from the 4% they were back in 2003 with the SARS outbreak. Back then, China was the world's workshop for kind of cheap goods, toys, sneakers, for instance, but now they're serious players in the spaces of sophisticated machine parts, electronics, etc. And I just found out this morning, also in Wuhan, there are 2 major professional hockey stick manufacturers of 3. So things are quite serious, actually. All joking aside, this is a global issue, and we're going to need global solutions. So I'm glad to have so many people on the call today, because we're going to have to work together to get through this. The situation requires a lot of flexibility. It definitely requires shared responsibility and fairness in expectations and specifications and in financial burden. So the epicenter of the outbreak is in Wuhan City and Hubei. There are 13 material facilities in Wuhan specifically manufacturing construction materials. Additionally, in Wuhan, there's significant production of metal products, electrical and electronics, mechanical equipment and components, and solar panels. With those over 500 manufacturing facilities in Wuhan that you can see on the left-hand side here, as I just mentioned on the last slide, there are 13 construction-specific manufacturing facilities. But if you look at the colored boxes here, there are 164 facilities that could be easily identified as potentially affecting a construction project. In addition to the ones listed on the last slide, you may also see impacts with regards to interior finishes, cabinets and tops, facade, drywall, insulation, PVC, metal products, just to name some. In addition to this direct exposure, the supply chains may also be disrupted from other trading partners operating in China or relying on China for raw materials, components, or products. There are almost 200 facilities domiciled outside of China in Wuhan. So while it would be easy to focus solely on products coming from the Chinese companies, in quotes, the scope is actually much larger and requires more careful attention. The supply chains may be disrupted from other trading partners operating in China and relying on China for their materials. Slide, please. So beyond Wuhan, what is the broader exposure? Well, I can tell you, and as Peter alluded to, it is definitely not just Wuhan, and it's not just Hubei. All of China is being impacted by this, with those city and region and province-wide quarantines we were talking about earlier. There's very limited travel, and the worker and migration restrictions have huge impact on all regions, regardless of how many cases are currently being reported therein. In other words, you can't look at a particular part of China and say, oh, this area is not affected, because they could have hundreds, thousands, millions of workers that just can't get back to the factories. 90% of the economic impact of outbreaks is typically indirect from disruption associated with attempts to contain its spread, and that's exactly what we're talking about. And then you knock on the overall effect on confidence, and the ripples will only amplify before they recede. Guangdong, Zhejiang, Henan, and Jiangsu, 4 of China's manufacturing powerhouses, also happen to be among the 10 most afflicted provinces, which means all their factories are sitting idle under the government stop work order. Even after it's lifted, I think this is going to continue. China has a much bigger role in these networks than it did at the time of that last major health outbreak, the SARS virus that we just talked about. So its problems are going to reverberate quickly through supply chains. The reliance is so high on those materials. So Wuhan is the epicenter, sure, but the exposure goes far beyond. Canada particularly imports over $48.5 billion from China annually, with over $500 million each of electrical and electronics, machinery, prefab buildings, plastic, glass, and iron and steel in 2018. So long story short, we're really going to find out how tied every company in the world is to China through this whole experience. Slide, please. So you start to try to pin down the impacts of this situation, and the more you think about it, the more interconnected everything gets. It's not just Wuhan, it's all of China. The effect is not just factories in Wuhan, but all of those others who can't get back to work. Manufacturing jobs specifically can't be completed remotely. Many jobs in Wuhan and in China in general are being done remotely right now, just as we're having this webinar remotely. But manufacturing jobs and many of the specialists who keep the manufacturing plants running definitely cannot do their work remotely. It's not just the workers and manufacturer, however, it's also the logistics. They're not able to get materials out by road. The rail system is strained as a result. Sea is subject to quarantine and to port closures. Air is suspended. A lot of cargo does move by air, especially if we're talking rather high-end parts and equipment. And any type of in-country quality or production monitoring that you have in place for materials manufactured in China will be disrupted. If it's a domestic resource in China, they may not be able to get to the facilities. As you all, I'm sure, are well aware, if you have someone Canada side that you need to get into China to have a look at materials being produced, well, number one, they're not being produced right now, and number two, they can't get in, and it's too dangerous for them to go, even if they could. It's also not just from China, it's through China. Supply chain management is not just knowing where your materials are being sourced or fabricating, it's also knowing how and when they're getting to your site, and that is seriously up in the air right now. Obviously, it's not just finished products, it's the raw materials and components. Even if a final product is not assembled in China, there may be a dependency on an affected supplier for the components or raw materials. And it's not just materials that are unavailable. It's materials that will become unaffordable. As in a catastrophic event, prices for materials will rise because everyone needs them and no one can get them. This can cause contracted parties to walk away if they are overexposed to that escalation. Everyone needs to be talking about this up and downstream of all of our projects to identify which partners may be particularly vulnerable to these impacts, causing them to walk away. Partners who would normally be fine, but if someone has an outsized exposure or a delicate financial balance sheet right now, this could be catastrophic and could affect us all. It's not just cost, it's the schedule. The time to resume manufacturing and shipping will definitely be significant. And we need to identify those activities and the associated float or lack thereof. To an extent, we can compress, we can stack, we can innovate the schedule, but there's a point at which it just doesn't have enough flexibility, and we will need some unique solutions from all parties in some circumstances to make the schedules work, or just to generally be realistic and make the adjustments that are required. And then finally, it's not just during this crisis, it's after. And what I mean by that is the long-term health of many of these manufacturing facilities may be threatened. In my head, I think of Chinese manufacturing, and I think of a giant operation owned by some corporation, but many of these facilities are mom and pop operations. So not just the coronavirus impact, but also we've had a 19-month trade war with the US that has weakened those facilities. It's life or death for many of these facilities. So there may be some serious after effects from this, just pressure upon pressure. Those resources already being stretched, maybe the death knell for some important manufacturing facilities. Slide, please. And one more. So what steps should we be taking right now to limit damage? It's time to develop awareness via a supply chain audit. Step one is just to know where you're engaged with this issue. Work with everyone in the chain to understand your exposures. Start by focusing on materials known to be from China and work your way all the way down. Another way to focus, and I just referenced it a moment ago, is to focus on any parties that you know may be particularly fragile and shore them up and make sure they are either not exposed or that there's a plan in place to help them weather this storm. An example of that would be a sub who already has some financial risk. You may have known about it when you contracted with that subcontractor, but at this time, that should be red alert, full attention. Let's do what we need to do to help that sub survive this impact. A big room approach is needed. This is a time to be fully transparent and discuss the scenarios openly for us to all come out on the other side of this all right. Slide, please. So what's the plan B in case you find that you're embroiled in this, which we almost certainly are? Well, first, that full risk register assessment. Give it a second look. Good on you if you did it when you started out thinking about doing a project, but now it's time to update that. So once you identify those risks, then you can act to mitigate them. A focused risk mitigation plan is called for, and that's a risk mitigation plan that is, just like the HR goals we set for our employees, a specific risk mitigation plan that is specific, that is measurable, that is actionable, relevant, and timely. So a SMART goal, a SMART risk mitigation plan is one that's going to be effective. Alternate suppliers may need to be engaged. The materials potential for escalation will need to be assessed. You may need to look into procuring additional stocks if they can be procured. If you have exposure with a particular downstream entity, revisit their financial qualifications to understand how vulnerable they are and assess what you've learned of their character. Some will stand up for their word and reputation, some will not. It's worth understanding who you are in the situation with, and this information will help to focus any risk mitigation measures. And all the risk cannot be pushed downstream. This is a global issue requiring global solutions. All members of the team need to be fully transparent fully collaborative and working for the success of the overall system. A solution that's overly hard on any one part of the supply chain will ultimately cause other problems, either now or down the road. It's worth thinking about your downstream partners' abilities to cover this escalation. Slide, please. And then there are a couple of points about lessons learned. If you can look back to your past and remember how your entity dealt with SARS or port closures or other similar impacts in the past, there may be some lessons learned that will apply to today. If there's anything that you can apply now, do it. Seek out those who were involved at that time if needed and understand how the situation was worked then. And certainly on a go-forward basis, plan for next time. There will be a next time. Make sure you capture the processes and lessons that work this time. Use today's pain, to lessen tomorrow's pain. So, slide, please. The more interconnected the world becomes, the more we will see this type of impact. Certainly, smart companies will emerge from this situation with a pocket full of lessons learned and will be better prepared going forward. So now is the time to work all together. Ask your upstream, ask your downstream, ask in between, and find out what works for all parties. Think it through. So what are the characteristics of that resilient supply chain that we all need to have? We need it to be transparent. You need to know your supply chain from end to end. I understand that is a mammoth undertaking. We need to openly discuss the potential issues and exposures with all parties. That's that big room approach that I was talking about earlier. Get everyone in a room and talk it through. Constantly communicate, constantly monitor. A resilient supply chain is also diverse. Avoid reliance on single sources where possible. Build very deep relationships with suppliers where it is not possible to avoid reliance on single sources. If you have a deep and strong relationship, certainly those suppliers will look to you first for the fulfillment of your orders. So it's worthwhile to build those relationships where that's possible. And also understand your supplier's redundancy and favor those who have it. All of this is very deep work, and it's a lot deeper than many of us typically dig, but very worthwhile in an increasingly connected world. Resilient supply chain is also flexible. Where those risks can't be avoided, we need to identify and manage them. Full risk register or SWOT analysis. The type of risk engineering that may at the time seem to be the opposite of value engineering, as it may end up costing us more to select materials and specifications and suppliers who are more flexible and able to deliver more consistently, but that money may be very well spent. And the smart risk mitigation plans that we talked about earlier. Where possible, consider proactive procurement and build in float for critical or long lead materials if you know that they're susceptible to this type of interruption. And then finally, learning, those lessons learned. A learning organization doesn't just snap back to the same shape that it was in before a crisis occurs. A learning organization learns and grows and changes shape to fit these situations. And that's what I would encourage all of you to do. For more look at the legal aspects, I will turn this over to Andrea Lee.
Thank you, Cherie, and thank you, Peter, for giving us the up-to-date information on COVID-19 and those practical ways to mitigate the effects of the virus. So now we'll take a look at the ramifications of the virus on construction projects from a contract perspective. Some of the questions you might be thinking about are, will parties here in Canada who are affected by COVID-19 be excused from their obligations, or will parties still be expected to perform their contracts, albeit on a different schedule or a different price? Next, please. So in Canada, if a contract becomes significantly more difficult to perform due to certain unforeseen events, parties may be able to rely on force majeure clauses in their contract. In order to rely on such a clause, I've set out some criteria there to take a look at. So the event must be an event that is specified in the contract and not within the control of the party relying on the clause. The event must be something that prevents or delays contract performance. It must make the performance of the contract substantially more difficult or more expensive. The event can't be the fault of the affected party. And finally, the affected party has to have exercised reasonable diligence to overcome whatever the challenges are that are presented by the force majeure event. So, construction contracts often have force majeure clauses. You sometimes see in negotiations that parties who feel that they may need some wiggle room down the road will often seek to expand the ambit of force majeure clauses, while those who want to hold others to the strict terms of the contract will try to limit the clause to extraordinary circumstances. I just wanted to quickly point out that there's a difference between a contract that can't be performed any longer, where the doctrine of frustration is applicable, and a force majeure clause. So where a contract becomes impossible to perform, it may be open for a party to argue that the contract has been frustrated, and then the obligations of the parties are at an end. However, with a force majeure clause, you're not saying the contract is at an end. There are ongoing obligations, although the parties may be excused from penalties or damages due to delayed performance or reduced supplies as examples. Next slide, please. So here we have some examples of force majeure events, and some of these might look familiar to you if you've ever reviewed your construction contract. So you've got strikes, work stoppages, wars, change in laws, acts of God, acts of terrorism. Epidemics and quarantines aren't so common, but perhaps we'll see more of that in days and years to come. Next, please. When we look at force majeure clauses that you might find in contracts, here are some components that you might see. So the first part of the clause might list the specific events. So for the purposes of this agreement, for example, force majeure will be defined as, and then you could refer back to the other slide, but it'll set out a list of specific events which, when they occur, parties can try to invoke the force majeure clause. The second bullet point there deals with notice. So this is important to look at. If there is a force majeure clause in your contract and it does contain notice requirements, then parties need to make sure that they're complying with these notice requirements, because the force majeure clause provides a right, but in order to exercise that right and benefit from that right, you need to strictly comply with the exact steps that might be set out in any notice provisions. And then the third bullet point here deals with ongoing obligations. So as I said before, where you're saying a contract is frustrated, that's where you're saying the contract is at an end. It can no longer be performed. We're calling it a day. However, when you're invoking the force majeure clause, it's usually a requirement that the affected party will use commercially reasonable efforts to continue performing the contract and avoid liability by being reasonable. Next slide, please. If you're familiar with CCDC contracts, I've taken a screenshot here to show you what the force majeure clause might look like in the CCDC contract. So 6.5.3 is the clause, and it sets out here a list of force majeure events. And you'll note that they're pretty specific, but then you get down to point 4, and that's quite broad. It says any cause beyond the contractor's control other than one resulting from a default or breach of contract by the contractor. And you should bear in mind too, when you read on with this clause, it's not that your obligations aren't at an end. You're hopefully, as a contractor, going to be getting an extension of contract time. This extension shall be the reasonable time as a consultant may recommend in consultation with the contractor. And again, note the last sentence here, which says the contractor is not going to be entitled to delay costs arising from this force majeure event unless the delay is resulting from something that the owner has control over. Next, please. So to give you some insight into how Canadian courts have interpreted force majeure clauses, I'll take you through 2 important cases. The first is from the Supreme Court of Canada, and the second one is from the Alberta Court of Appeal. So here on the screen, I've just summarized for you the Atlantic Paper Stock decision. Here, St. Anne owned and operated a pulp and paper mill in New Brunswick. The marketing forecast looked to the United States as an important outlet. St. Anne entered into a 10-year contract with Atlantic Paper for secondary paper fiber. The contract had a force majeure clause that said that St. Anne would buy a certain tonnage each year unless there was, and there was a list of specified events which included the non-availability of markets for pulp. So after only 1 year, St. Anne notified Atlantic Paper that it wouldn't accept any more secondary paper fiber due to the non-availability of markets. So Atlantic Paper sued for damages. The trial judge allowed recovery, but then the Court of Appeal reversed that decision. Atlantic appealed to the Supreme Court. And there, the Supreme Court asked 3 questions, which I've put up there for you. If markets were unavailable to St. Anne, did they become so because of something unexpected happening after the date of the contract? Was the change so radical as to strike at the root of the contract? And finally, could St. Anne, through the exercise of reasonable skill, have found markets? And so the court held that St. Anne's problems arose not from the non-availability of markets, but from the lack of an effective marketing plan and high operating costs. So the court found that the defendant simply priced itself out of any available existing market and restored the trial judge's decision, and Atlantic was awarded damages. So it's worthwhile noting here that the court did not allow St. Anne to rely on the force majeure clause to excuse performance just because the contract was no longer profitable for it. So there was an obligation on parties to act reasonably to find alternatives and to mitigate the effects of the force majeure event. And so this is the case that established the modern day framework here in Canada for force majeure clauses. Next, please. This is the second case that I mentioned from the Alberta Court of Appeal. This one is the decision in Atcor and Continental Energy. So here a supplier agreed to supply a buyer with natural gas delivered through a pipeline. The agreement had a force majeure clause which listed among the force majeure events breakages of pipelines or damage to the pipeline. So during the contract there were pipeline failures, and the supplier had to, they stopped delivering under its interruptible supply contract, but didn't reduce deliveries to its other firm supply customers. So the buyer, in this case, was given reduced amounts and had to find an alternative source of gas at a greater cost. So the buyer sued the supplier for breach of contract. The trial judge found that the supplier was not liable since the force majeure clause applied, but the Court of Appeal set aside that decision and ordered a new trial. So the Court of Appeal said, in order to be excused from performance, the supplier had to show that the pipeline made performance commercially impractical or unreasonable. So it would have had a duty to perform the agreement, if it was commercially reasonable for the supplier to find some new supply. So since neither party had led evidence on the cost of replacement gas or the scope of the supplier's business and what actions would be reasonable, the Court of Appeal held that a new trial was required. And the Court of Appeal here cited the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Atlantic and said, force majeure events have to be unexpected, something beyond reasonable human foresight and skill, since the purpose of this clause is to protect parties from events outside of normal business risk. And so those two cases are really important for us to consider in the circumstances. And if you could turn to the next slide, please. Just quickly, I wanted to give an example of, not necessarily an epidemic situation, but a situation where the cost of materials, went up, and how the courts dealt with it. So, here we've got the tariffs that were imposed by the U.S. on steel and aluminum coming into the country in 2018. The tariffs were on goods coming in from any other country besides Canada and Mexico. So numerous state and federal courts in the U.S. Actually refused to enforce or apply force majeure clauses where the government's action only affected the profitability of a contract, but didn't actually prevent performance. And so in those cases, parties weren't relieved of their contractual obligations. And here, so at the bottom of the slide there, I just want to note that the steel industry has formulated force majeure clauses to specifically address shortages of materials such as steel. So for example, there's this provision by one of the major associations. This clause allows for prices to fluctuate after a stated date. So this is something that association is asking its members to consider including in its contracts. Next slide, please. Now turning to epidemics. We looked at SARS, so I don't necessarily need to take you through the stats again, but it's important to note, I think for the purposes of a legal analysis, that the World Health Organization it classified SARS on a global scale as a communicable disease outbreak rather than an infectious epidemic. And, the news media was certainly describing the outbreak as an epidemic, but, the World Health Organization didn't go that far. And in Ontario, the government classified SARS as a communicable and virulent disease. And the Canadian health authorities also didn't classify SARS as an epidemic. So, looking at SARS, could SARS have been a force majeure event? I can tell you that I wasn't able to find any case law on that. But, if we look back at the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Atlantic and ask ourselves the three questions that came out of that, firstly, was SARS an unexpected change after the contract outside of the party's control? I would say the answer to that is, likely yes. It's not that parties are expecting there to be a new worldwide virus that affects thousands of people. However, given that it wasn't called an epidemic, it's questionable whether SARS would have qualified as a force majeure event. Second question is, was the change so radical as to strike at the root of the contract? So that is entirely dependent on what the contract is about. If it involves the construction of a project in Canada and the contract is about obtaining building components from a SARS-affected area that was still operating but just at a slower pace, likely the answer to this question would be no. If you could still get the building components, just perhaps at a slower rate. Could the parties, through the exercise of reasonable skill, have found replacements or workarounds? And again, this is dependent on the specific contract, but again, if the parties can obtain building components from a non-SARS affected area, for example, then the answer to this question is also likely no. And so you'll recall, what we looked at in that Alberta Court of Appeals decision in ADCOR. If a contracting party can otherwise continue to satisfy its contractual obligations in a commercially reasonable manner, then the force majeure clause will not operate to absolve that party of its contractual responsibilities. Next slide, please. More recently than SARS, we saw the Ebola outbreak. The most significant outbreak happened between 2014 and 2016. So I took a screenshot here of all of the times that Ebola has come up. And that was, a bit news to me. I wasn't aware that it frequently repeated. It's just that in that 2014-2016 period, there was the number of cases and deaths arising from Ebola was unprecedented. So we look at Ebola through the lens of the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Atlantic. Is this an unforeseen, unexpected change of contract outside of the party's control? And there's an interesting article by two authors named Gilles and Barinholtz called Ebola Outbreak, Is It a Force Majeure Event? A Regional Pandemic. So in this article, the authors note that an Ebola outbreak may fall short of a force majeure event because it might be considered foreseeable due to recent history in certain parts of Africa. And so, this is, they say it's true for companies with ongoing operations in parts of Africa that are affected, almost on a biannual basis. And again, as we noted with the SARS analysis, there is a requirement for parties to mitigate the effects of any virus. Next slide, please. And here we get to COVID-19. And so you've got a lot of the stats from Peter at the beginning of the webinar. On the screen here, you've got the most recent situation report released by the World Health Organization. And I think, as Peter mentioned, on the 30th of January, the WHO took the rare step of declaring COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern. And so they define that as an extraordinary event that constitutes a public health risk to other states through the international spread of disease and potentially requires a coordinated international response. Next slide, please. On the same day that the World Health Organization made that declaration, the China Council for Promotion of International Trade released a statement confirming that China was offering force majeure certificates to local companies that were unable to fulfill their contracts due to the outbreak. So we know that the council issued its first certificate to a car part supplier who was unable to meet its contract with Peugeot's African plant because of the outbreak and because the government had imposed a 2-week production halt. By last Friday, the council had issued 1,600 certificates over 30 sectors with a total contract value of just over $15.5 billion US. So the council advises that its force majeure certificates are accepted by governments, customs, trade associations, and enterprises in more than 200 countries. But of course, whether the outbreak can be considered a force majeure event will depend on the wording of any specific contract. So, for example, we've heard that in the news, China National Offshore Oil Corp, which is the nation's biggest LNG buyer, they attempted to invoke their force majeure clause and told some of their suppliers, such as Shell and Total, that it won't take delivery of cargoes because of COVID-19 related constraints. So Total, Shell I don't think has responded, but Total has rejected the declaration, and it takes a position that there's no real quarantine in all of the unloading ports of China. So for the time being, Total is saying its contract must continue. Next, please. So what is the effect, or what will be the effect of COVID-19 here in Canada? Again, I want to take us back through the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Atlantic, and remember to consider the following questions. So, is COVID-19 an unexpected change after a contract outside of the control of the parties? Is the virus so radical as to strike at the root of the contract? And can the parties, through the exercise of reasonable skill, find a way to mitigate? And so answering the first question, I would hazard a guess that COVID is certainly an unexpected event. It may be covered in your specific force majeure clauses as a listed event. So that's something to look out for, is whether or not government action or epidemics are listed as a force majeure event. And considering the second question, there again, you have to look at what the contract is about, and does COVID-19 change the landscape so drastically that it affects the real purpose of that contract? So I would say that unless there is a specific material or some specialty component that is only made in China, which is really integral to the project here in Canada, I'm not sure that it is likely going to be a change that strikes at the root of the contract. And finally, answering the last question, if a party is affected, can they find a way to work around the virus? So what will be commercially reasonable for a party is going to be a very fact-specific inquiry. As we saw in the Alberta Court of Appeal decision in ACCOR, the court wanted to hear evidence about what the supplier, what efforts the supplier made, what was commercially reasonable for that specific supplier, and so it has to be, a really exceptional problem and not just one that causes some economic hardship. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, we have a situation here that is novel and it is in flux. There may be a way to be excused from strict compliance with performance requirements if there is a force majeure clause in a contract. But parties need to be cautious in declaring a force majeure event on the basis of COVID-19, because doing so may actually result in the other party being entitled to damages for breach of contract. So, before companies attempt to invoke the clause, or when they receive notice of a force majeure event, I think they should consider a few points. Firstly, is COVID-19 within the ambit of force majeure clause? Does it somehow fall into one of the specified events? Secondly, is there a notice provision that needs to be complied with? Who should the notice be sent to and how? In writing or email? It's extremely important to note that such provisions may be conditions precedent to an affected party's right to rely on a force majeure clause. Three, are there any obligations in the force majeure clause to continue to use reasonable efforts to mitigate against the impact of the force majeure event? So, do you need to seek alternative sources of materials? Look for ways to work around the issue. Because again, if the affected party doesn't comply with all of the requirements of the force majeure clause, then its non-performance may not be excused. And finally, again, as the court said in ATCOR, think about what evidence might be useful if you feel like there might be litigation over this issue. Are there contemporaneous records which can help? Are there notes of meetings and emails and so forth? Companies who are on the receiving end of force majeure notice will likely require the affected party to provide complete information in relation to how the event is a force majeure event and how it has affected the party trying to rely on the clause. And just for practical considerations, I want to echo what Sherry talked about earlier. So, even if there is a force majeure clause, I think parties should think about how to work together. So here's where, legal principles meet real world. I just put up these points to consider. Sherry mentioned the big room approach and communication being key. So, I would agree with that. The earlier that a problem arising from COVID-19 is identified and notice is provided to all project participants, there can be a joint effort made to minimize the harm to all parties up and down the chain. Secondly, any steps should be taken with the bigger picture in mind. So, if a party tries to invoke a force majeure clause now, what's that going to look like in the scope of a project that is multi-phased or scheduled over the course of years? We just have no insight right now as to what's happening with COVID-19 and when it may or hopefully may peter out. And think about will acceleration measures or alternative sources of materials be required, and bear in mind what the Supreme Court of Canada said. Just because one party can no longer participate in the contract at a profit doesn't relieve it of its contractual obligations. And I think that's touches on something that Cherie said earlier, that it might be that all parties need to share the burden of COVID-19 and increase costs or delay as a result. So that's it for my part. I'll turn it back over to Peter.
Thanks very much, Andrea, and I certainly appreciate
Peter?
I can't hear them either.
I'm here still.
Cherie's here as well.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead. If there's any questions, you can actually ask, or there was one question that was actually done. Peter, I'm just trying to work on to see what happened there to you as hello, Peter? Yeah.
Hey, Cherie here. I can go ahead and take a swing at this question in the panel here, which is questions from participants. Are the panel aware of any ships being denied entry to ports other than passenger vessels, I think is the gist of it. I don't know of any ships being denied entry into ports, but I do know that crew have been quarantined from those ships. I don't have any details on that. I just came across that anecdotally as I was doing my research for this presentation. Andrea, have you heard anything about that?
Well, I think that's where my note about Total rejecting the CNOOC's force majeure clause came in, because I think the Chinese company was trying to cancel delivery because it said that certain ports were closed, whereas Total was taking the position that not all ports were closed. So there was still an ability for CNOOC to take delivery. But I'm not sure which of the ports are open and which are actually closed off.
So that's rather an incomplete answer from both of us, but at least we know there must be something to it, right? I know that there are a couple of the Chinese ports that are closed. That is absolutely true. Are there other questions?
I think that's all I see on my side from the web.
Me too.
I don't. This is Kenny, by the way, and I'm not seeing any other questions as well for some strange reason. I don't know why Peter got cut off from us, actually. If there's any other questions, just give 1 more minute, actually, and I'd be happy to take them on the chat, or you can actually ask as well. There's one other question on the chat. I'll just send it to the panel as well right now. Just send a question to, I'm not sure who wants to take it, whether Andrea wants to take it or whether Sherry wants to take it.
Hi, it's Andrea. It looks like the question is incomplete. What's been typed into the chat box?
One second. Yeah, you should have that now.
Is it possible to talk? To ask
Yeah,
a question?
it is.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I've just unmuted the microphone, but it keeps muting back on. Hi, my name's Paige. I'm actually joining from the United Arab Emirates because I was quite curious about what your perspectives were from another country. Internationally, contracts tend to be often based on the 1999 FIDIC suite, and that includes, sorry, it was my question that didn't show up. That includes in the force majeure definition a requirement that the events be in the country. Usually country is defined as the country where the works are being performed. And so one of the problems we have, we actually do have a project where we have 4 suppliers who are impacted and are unable to provide items on the project. We have workarounds for most of them, but one of them is a long lead item, which is 2 escalators. And we are going to get these things for beyond the date for completion of the project now. And so in giving a force majeure notice, the challenge is the event occurring in the country? So we are trying your various notices and things to describe what's happening as a global event. I'm just wondering if you have any views. So what we've focused on is the fact that the WHO has declared it as an international emergency, that countries around the world are all affected. The things our own government has done here, which is actually quite limited. It's limited to reducing flights into China, not eliminating, only reducing. They've shut down flights to Guangzhou and Shanghai, but they've kept them open to Beijing and Hong Kong. So I was just wondering if you have any other suggestions for dealing with the in-country requirement.
Hi, Paige. It's Andrea. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Good, thanks. So, I mean, again, I think that just looking at some of the court decisions, I think that it is, and so that one point that I made about, keeping track of all the evidence that you might end up having to use down the road, I think that's really key to show what efforts have been made to find a commercially reasonable solution to this. I think that's going to affect whether or not you can rely on that force majeure clause. So, if there was some alternative available in the country, be it at a more expensive cost, then even that becomes a fact-specific inquiry. So, what is unreasonable for the affected party to be paying? If it's exorbitant and it doesn't make sense, then I think it would be likely that a court might find that it really is a force majeure event that should excuse, delays or additional costs.
We've actually looked into air freighting the pieces of equipment once they're available, and the cost of that, is a few million dirham, which is pretty significant, but it is what it is. Fortunately, on that particular project, we've got a very reasonable employer, but we are expecting. I don't know if Canada is as reliant on Chinese manufacturing as we are here. Pretty much everything you buy here is made in China, and so this country is being really hard hit.
Right, and
already.
I think that's the point that Sherry made about the big room approach is key, right? Because who knows what your client has in store for them on if they've got obligations to a tenant or if they've got obligations to other parties, so I think that communication piece is key. And if you advise them up front and early that you might still be able to get the escalators. It's just at a more expensive cost because you've got these shipping costs now. Perhaps there will be a way to, for your client to either, help you bear the cost of that or pass it along to the end user.
If there is, I don't see any other questions on the chat unless somebody has a question. Peter, I think you are back online again, I believe.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can.
Yes.
Oh, that's strange. I'm not sure what happened there, but in any event, big thanks to my fellow panelists here, and of course the Canadian Construction Association. As I probably trailed off there, but your closing points, Andrea, I think are very astute, and also your point, Cherie, around this being again a big room issue. There's going to be a lot of communication required from all party stakeholders on a go-forward basis. So I think there's a real role for the Canadian Construction Association to play in this issue moving forward. I certainly look forward to engaging on this around the table as we navigate through this, and certainly encourage everyone to keep a close eye on, and again, dig deep into the supply chain, understand your contract, understand your risks. Thanks again to everyone for hanging out this late. I appreciate we're 15 minutes over time, and then apologies to anyone affected by the sound issues. I had some concerns right from there. Closing thoughts to anyone?
If Cherie and Andrea doesn't have, on behalf of the Canadian Construction Association, thank you, Peter, Cherie, and Andrea for being the expert panel for this one. And of course, we will always bring topical issues on our future webinars as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.